How important is access to capital for determining the viability of renewable energy projects? How relevant is the current configuration of the grid or the high voltage electricity network to determining whether renewables are able to compete? And thirdly, what is the impact of subsidies that are actually afforded to fossil fuel projects in given countries? Those are questions that have arisen out of recent videos published on this channel that have come from viewers, and we're going to spend a few moments trying to address those in today's episode of Climate Mundial's Energy and Climate Weekly. So let's get right into it. These questions arise based on some videos that have been produced on this channel recently, where I covered the announcement by the International Renewable Energy Agency, which suggested that renewable energy was more cost effective in 91% of the cases when compared to fossil fuel based generation. And so what I sought to do in the video was clarify that there was this distinction between a new build context, in which case it's important to look at the levelised cost of electricity generation as the comparator to see which is the more cost-effective solution, versus the situations where there's already a grid with operational projects, some of which use fossil fuels, and whether or not renewables are actually able to come in, penetrate those markets, and displace those fossil fuel-based sources of generation. Now, from a climate change perspective, this is extremely important because, as we know, around 30% of all global emissions actually occur as a result of the generation of electricity. So that's around 16.8 billion tonnes of the 50.1 billion taken from the year 2022, which is the most recent year when data for the entire world is available. So that's a very significant chunk of global emissions that is arising as a result of generating electricity using fossil fuels. So we need to be able to separate this into the two question areas, which is one, whether renewables is more cost effective as a new build versus whether renewables can actually displace fossil fuels and compete in those areas. So it's that context with which we examine these three questions in today's video. So the first question is, does access to capital actually impact the viability of renewable energy projects? Now, in principle, the answer to this would be no, that a renewable energy project, when evaluated, would deliver an internal rate of return and a levelised cost which is either superior to or inferior to a fossil fuel-based alternative. Though in practice, what we know is that access to finance is extremely important and relevant. And this is particularly so in some emerging market countries, or global south countries as sometimes they get referred to. And that is because a lot of the finance that would be needed to invest in and to bring renewable energy projects to financial close is actually delivered by institutions that are not based in the country where the project is taking place. In other words, the capital markets of certain emerging market countries may not have the full capability and capacity to fund all of these developments. This is often problematic because the international financiers deal in their home currency and not necessarily in the currency of the country where the project is being financed. And that leaves the financier with a very significant risk related to currency devaluations or appreciations in value. It also exposes the financier to differences in interest rates and inflation in the two different jurisdictions. So it actually becomes a very, very important problem. So my answer to this question is yes, indeed. Access to capital, especially in emerging market contexts where there isn't necessarily a developed capital markets service industry which can finance all the projects which are being contemplated, is indeed a very important barrier to the progress of renewable energy in emerging market contexts. The next question is about the relevance of the current configuration of the grid or the high voltage electricity network in a relevant country, where one is considering whether renewables have the financial characteristics that enable them to displace fossil fuel fired generation. Now, this is a really important one because a lot of the grids that we're talking about have been built with specific fossil fuel projects in mind and for connection. And some of them happened a long time ago. In other words, the network infrastructure that would otherwise be needed to take the energy and the electricity from a renewable energy project and transport it to the centers of load and where the people actually need the electricity, in some cases has not been built, and the historic infrastructure caters for the fossil fuel plants. And that's just a characteristic of the legacy of where we've come from. Now, there are some instances in which renewable energy can be located in areas which is actually very close to the existing infrastructure. And I refer to a specific example on which I actually worked in Egypt, where a 1.8 gigawatt solar installation was able to be installed in a location called Benban, which is actually very close to the existing Aswan Dam, which is a hydroelectric power plant. But importantly, the high voltage infrastructure leads from the dam back to where the main load centers are in the country of Egypt. So actually, the Benban location, in addition to having a fantastic solar resource, became a very good location to put a project because there was already this high voltage infrastructure. But not every renewable project has that advantage. And in those cases, it may be necessary to build the high voltage network infrastructure to actually evacuate that electricity and take it to where the loads are. And that can be very expensive. Now, in those cases, it may be necessary to build those costs of connection into the calculations to determine whether renewable energy is actually more viable than a fossil fuel based alternative, which doesn't necessarily have to be located in that specific location. So these are very important considerations to make as well, and in many cases could actually determine whether or not a renewable energy project, even in a greenfield situation, is actually viable with respect to the fossil fuel-based alternatives. Now, one solution that is often contemplated is whereby the network infrastructure is actually built and financed, not specifically loading the cost onto a renewable energy project, but rather distributing those costs over consumers in the entire network. Now, that's a solution that's used in many countries. It does, however, though, have the impact of increasing the overall cost of electricity for a given population. So that's really important to note, and this is something that could result in a negative influence on renewable energy projects, and it's really got to do with the current configuration of network infrastructure in a given country, as well as the specific locations where the renewable resources are and the barriers associated with commercially delivering that infrastructure to ensure that evacuation can take place. The final question relates to whether or not subsidies for fossil fuels actually negatively affect the viability of renewables. Now, the short answer to that question is absolutely yes. If there's a situation where a fossil fuel-based electricity generator is receiving some type of incentive or subsidy from a public agency, that is going to improve the net competitive position of the fossil fuel generator vis-a-vis an alternative renewable energy project. And that's in a situation where the renewable energy project is being considered for displacing the fossil fuel-based generation. It's a little bit rarer to see subsidies affecting fossil fuels on new build examples, although in some cases it may happen. And of course, it would have the same negative effect. It's also worth pointing out that a lot of the global studies that have been done on the extent to which fossil fuel industries are actually being subsidized, a lot of the subsidies applicable actually relate to liquid fuels and transport fuels as opposed to electricity generation. But nonetheless, it is still very, very important to take into account if there has been a subsidy applied to fossil fuel based generation when one considers this overall question of whether renewable energy can compete with fossil fuels, both in the new build situation as well as substituting fossil fuels on existing grids. These equations are generally taken into account as one does the levelised cost analysis, but it does depend very much on the specific circumstances being evaluated. So in some countries, the fossil fuels subsidies are much more prevalent and need to be taken into account. In other countries, they may not exist, in which case they're not so relevant. So it's very much a country by country and specific basis in which those subsidies would be relevant. And so there you have it, some answers to those very important questions that have been raised by members of the audience and viewers. And in particular, these issues do relate to the nitty-gritty specifics of individual cases as opposed to the more general question. But it's very important that as one gets into evaluating whether or not renewables are going to be viable, it's important to look at the context in every case. And there might be some instances in which things like access to capital, the current configuration of the electricity network, or indeed subsidies available to fossil fuel-based generation, all would impact the evaluations that take place, whether it be new build or whether it be looking at renewables penetrating existing grids and displacing some fossil fuels. So in principle, all three very, very good questions. And I hope you found the information that I've shared in response to those illuminating or at least useful. So thank you very much for your attention today. If you've liked the video, please don't forget to hit like, subscribe if you have not already done so, and please don't hesitate to share this video with your colleagues, family and friends, because it really does help the channel. It helps me also to identify what topics are of interest, and that can assist me with planning for future video topics. So thanks again, and I look forward to seeing you again soon in the next episode of Climate Mondial's Energy and Climate Weekly. Bye for now.